I am delighted to be here today to provide some of my perspectives on how we can accelerate global pediatric therapeutics development. And I hope during my brief introductory remarks that I can set the stage for what I think will be stimulating and substantive discussions on all the important topics that are a part of the agenda. And I do want to thank Certara and all the organizers of this meeting for the opportunity to participate. I have no disclosures, and I also want to point out that the views represented in this talk are mine and not necessarily the FDA's. So in thinking about how we accelerate development for children in the 21st century, I do think that we need to look back a little bit and understand the history and how we've built success to this point. If we go back to the early 2000s, the late 1990s, really, the US enacted two important pieces of legislation: the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, BPCA, which was an incentive provision, and the Pediatric Research Equity Act, which was a requirement provision. And many of you know very much about these two important US laws. And along with that, in the early 2000s was the publication of the ICH E11 guideline entitled The Clinical Investigation of Medicinal Products in the Pediatric Population. I just want to point out that in the late 1990s, early 2000s, it wasn't as though that we knew a lot about how to do pediatric drug development. In fact, I would argue that ICH E11 was really more aspirational as a guidance than it was a practical A to Z guide on how to do therapeutics development in children. In fact, it set very high level ethical and scientific guidance on, if you were going to do a pediatric clinical trial, here's how to think about it. But over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, we really gained a lot of experience, and really, I would argue, a lot of success in clinical trials and therapeutics approvals and labeling of drugs for use in children. And during that period of the early 2000s, I think the European Union had begun to think about what did their regulation, what would their regulation look like? And what they really wisely did was take and evaluate the successes of the US legislation, incorporate some of those, but then add, I think, a few additional improvements on what we had in the United States, including the establishment of the PEDCO, as well as the requirement to submit a pediatric investigational plan early in a product development in the adult timeline. And what the US did was follow suit just a few years later in the establishment of the pediatric study plans in 2012. And shortly before that, in 2007 timeframe, the creation of our own Pediatric Review Committee, or the PERC, and the creation of the Pediatric Cluster, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. If we move forward then into the second decade of the 21st century, I think what we recognized was that we did have some experience now, and we wanted to bring that experience forward in revised guidance. And so that was the idea behind the publication of the ICH 11 Revision 1 or Addendum, in which we brought forward more discussion of the experience that we had gained, and particularly, what does a study plan look like? What kind of questions need to be answered? And also, at a very high level, how to think about pediatric extrapolation. But even at the time of the ICH 11R1, when it was published in 2017, there was a clear understanding that we needed to have more specific guidance on the use of pediatric extrapolation. And I will spend some time to talk about that later. So I want to bring up just a couple of slides to show you how I think we've advanced and some data to support that. If you look at these sort of 5-year cohorts since the passage of the legislation, or at least the incentive provisions in 1999, you can see that there were very few obviously no clinical studies done under BPCA and PREA because they didn't exist yet, but a steady increase in the number of studies completed under BPCA and PREA. And on this slide, these are the total numbers of patients enrolled in those BPCA and PREA trials. Now, what I think is important if you look at this slide is you would say, well, gee, there are fewer patients enrolled. That sounds bad, or looks bad. But in fact, combined with the increased number of trials, I think what this shows is that, firstly, that the easy stuff, the large pediatric clinical trials, conditions that are easy to enroll in, those were constituted early wins in those first 5 years. What we've had to do is work maybe smarter and more efficiently. And I think that's what the data show here, that in the last 10 years, certainly, we've become more efficient and required fewer children enrolled in clinical trials, but also probably because of necessity, because many of the diseases in which drugs are being developed now have pediatric populations that are much smaller. So that sort of, I think, sets the stage. How do we get therapeutics development done in a setting of smaller populations and maybe higher unmet need? So I like to think of it in 4 sort of broad areas. I call them the 4 I's, if you will. Increased global collaborations, improved application of pediatric extrapolation, innovations in trial designs and analysis, and involvement of patients, families, and stakeholders. And I want to take a few minutes to discuss each of these topics. If we look at global regulatory collaborations, I certainly can't speak about regulatory collaborations without bringing the importance of the Pediatric Cluster. Established in 2007, as I mentioned earlier, and now includes regulatory authorities from 5 regions. We have, in the last 14, 15 years, exchanged information on over 600 products and almost 200 general topics. And I think really a success of this collaboration is that over 70% of the time now, we're really achieving convergence on our approach to development plans in any given specific field. This slide shows here, just in the last calendar year, 2020, the types of discussions that were held and convened at the Pediatric Cluster under the certain areas of therapeutics development. You can see a high of 17 oncology discussions, but it also shows sort of the breadth of discussions in almost all areas of development. We convened 10 regular meetings and 7 ad hoc meetings, and those 7 ad hoc meetings, many of them were to discuss, of course, the global pandemic related to COVID-19 in 2020. These topics included 51 product discussions and 6 general topics. Another important program that was implemented in 2012 as part of the cluster call was the creation of the Common Commentary, a document that is sent to sponsors to describe discussions that were had at the cluster. A sponsor can ask for a common commentary to be issued, and we do our best to issue comments to the sponsor after we've had a discussion at the cluster. You can see here over the last 9 years or so, 53 common commentaries spanning, again, a very broad range of topics, including 6 general topics. And I, again, want to highlight the importance of the cluster during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've convened 10 discussions since 2020, and as I mentioned, 7 just during the 2020 calendar year, and really helped us to achieve early alignment, regulatory timelines for pediatric therapeutics development under the umbrella of therapeutics being developed for adult COVID. And I think that's really a testament to the willingness to collaborate and the clear recognized need across regulatory authorities to get it right for children early as part of the pandemic. we issued also a public comment commentary on alignment of regulatory submissions for EMA and FDA related to COVID-19 therapies very early in the pandemic, because we recognized that it would be important not to create roadblocks for sponsors who were really working at tremendous pace to get therapies evaluated. And we did achieve rapid alignment. I think that's really, I'm proud of the cluster for the work that they've done. And I also just want to point out that the vaccine clusters have been very active too. And most of the vaccines have been discussed rather than in the pediatric cluster, in the vaccine cluster. I also want to highlight some other important regulatory collaborations. And these are specific regulatory, international regulatory collaborations. The first I want to present about is the World Health Organization Pediatric Research Network. We call it the WHO PRN, reactivated in 2019. And our last meeting that we held in April of this year included pediatric specialist representatives from 22 national regional authorities across the globe. And you can see here the important mission of the WHO PRN is really to facilitate communication and collaboration across both small, medium, and large regulatory authorities for the benefit of children. I will talk a little bit more about the ICH guideline on pediatric extrapolation, but suffice to say here that we have assembled a really top-notch group of regulators, industry representatives, all who are very dedicated to advancing therapeutics development for children, and many of whom are panelists and speakers at this very meeting. And then finally, just a brief acknowledgement of the hard work in Asia through our colleagues at the PMDA for the creation of the Asian Training Center and a collaboration with FDA in the creation of a pediatric review workshop that we've held annually since 2018, attracts drug developers and interested parties and academics in pediatric therapeutics development across the globe, particularly in Asia. I also want to highlight very briefly two international regulatory initiatives that you may not have heard of, and in fact aren't necessarily directly related to pediatrics, but I think may have some application to therapeutics development in children. That includes Project OBIS, which was launched in 2019, actually by the Oncology Center of Excellence at FDA, where FDA identifies applications, oncology applications for drugs of potential high impact, and brings these applications, these products under development into discussions with, now it's expanded to 5 other regulatory authorities that are listed on this slide, with the goal of using a common submission template. So the idea is that that would allow for concurrent review of the application across these regulatory authorities and lead to a decreased time, for example, from approval in one authority till approval in other authorities. Keeping in mind that each country retains full independence in their regulatory decision-making and, of course, their labeling, but does use a common submission template to allow for a more efficient review process across regulatory authorities. Another important regulatory initiative is the Access Consortium. And this is a collaboration of 5 medium-sized regulatory authorities listed here, you can see. And is focused really specifically on work sharing, such that a submission is created and sent to these 5 regions simultaneously, and the regions work to share the review of the application with the goal of reducing duplication and increasing efficiency for these medium-sized authorities, and hopefully leading to then earlier and coordinated decisions by these regulatory authorities. I think the reason I bring these up is because I think that they may have some application in the pediatric development space, and I would love to hear opinions about those who have experience with these 2 initiatives, and also how you think they might apply in the pediatric space. Of course, we have now very well established and very effective and successful clinical research networks. This is not necessarily led by regulators, but led by through public-private partnerships, through academic collaborations, regional collaborations, disease-specific collaborations. It really runs across a wide spectrum of both regions and types of networks now. And I only bring up some of these because this is not intended to be a comprehensive list, just to highlight that really international collaborations also require that these trials can be done more efficiently if we work together through programs such as networks. So turning towards now to pediatric extrapolation, my next area, the improved application of pediatric extrapolation. This slide just reviews very briefly sort of the evolution of pediatric extrapolation, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. Suffice to say that, again, in the pediatric rule that was promulgated by FDA in 1994 brings up the whole concept of pediatric extrapolation, but not because it was, again, a well-worn path to approval, but sort of an idea, if you will, a concept that maybe we could accept something less as a path towards substantial evidence if we had confidence and approval in adequate and well-controlled trials in adult populations. Fast forward to the last really 25 years to the publication of the 2018 final EMA reflection paper that really, I think, advanced to what I will call the modern definition and modern view of pediatric extrapolation. It creates this framework to think about it, the creation of a concept, what kind of data and what kind of analyses do you need to conduct to consider how diseases are the same between or similar between a reference and source or target population, and also how to use quantitative approaches, at least to encourage the use of quantitative approaches, both in the creation of the concept and of the plan. So I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the ICH E11A extrapolation guideline that we're currently working on. The concept paper was put forth in 2017, shortly after the E11R1, that initial guideline, the initial revision, of the guideline was published. And the idea is that we would try in this guideline to provide aligned terminology so that we could say the same thing across the world when we were talking about extrapolation, to provide information on approaches to support, again, the concept or the development of a concept, what data you need to support that the diseases are or the conditions are similar between a reference and target population, how to systematically approach the use of extrapolation, and then finally, what types of quantitative methodologies can we use and put forward as an approach to data collection in an extrapolation plan. So I put together this slide just to, conceptually provide a framework for, I think, an approach that I hope that the guideline is beginning to take shape and will put forward. And so if you look sort of from left to right, again, if we're thinking about a similarity of disease in response to therapy, moving from the left where we don't believe that the diseases are different to the right where we believe that the diseases are the same. What types of evidence do we have to support that establishment or that conclusion about similarity or difference? And what types of data do we have at our disposal to review as evidence to support similarity? Well, we might conclude diseases are different if there are large gaps in knowledge about similarity, or in fact, we have no data about whether diseases are the same between adults and children. or a reference and target population. And we may go all the way to the right-hand side where we have a very high quality data and an abundance of data that lead us to high confidence that the diseases are the same. Those types of conclusions about the sameness of the disease and the amount of data and the confidence we have that the diseases are the same will ultimately be reflected in the type of study design we decide to choose that will fill in whatever gaps in knowledge we have. Moving from the left, if we have belief that the diseases are different or that we have no data or large gaps in knowledge, we might need adequate and well-controlled trial or trials to support effectiveness in the pediatric population. And then all the way to the right-hand side where we could even imagine exposure matching to a dose that we know is effective in a reference population, or to even consider concurrent enrollment of pediatric patients in adult or other older pediatric trials. So I hope that the guidance, the ICH E11A guidance, and that the approach to extrapolation also will highlight, this middle area that includes many different types of study designs, from Bayesian approaches to modified frequentist approaches, and use of bridging biomarkers. So these are all areas I think that I hope that the E11A extrapolation guideline hopes to discuss and provide more clear guidance on. In addition to understanding sort of the framework, I believe that it's important to have an understanding about how these innovations play a role in pediatric extrapolation. I mentioned earlier that the trial should be designed to fill gaps in knowledge. But how do you fill gaps in knowledge, and how do you most efficiently understand and make use of all the knowledge that you have? I hope that over the course of the next day or two, we talk about the increased use of model-informed drug development and the incorporation of external data in trial designs that leverage more innovative statistical analysis approaches and study designs, including Bayesian approaches, and how we might rationally and reasonably incorporate real-world evidence. However, I don't want you to think that I'm, this unbridled enthusiasm for Bayesian designs and that, yes, we should absolutely model everything. Of course, the model is only as good as the quantity and qualitative data we have to create the model and the accuracy of the assumptions in any model we create. Certainly also depends in terms of, innovative statistical approaches and study designs that we have confidence in the data that have already been collected and their applicability to be leveraged. So, it's very important that we have transparency in all of these processes so that we can have really honest conversations about how these innovative approaches could be reasonably used. In addition, besides these innovative approaches, we've got to think really hard about the hard work of really understanding how pathophysiological processes through biomarkers and other markers and endpoints are similar or not between reference and target. And that requires upfront early work if they're going to be useful in a pediatric program. And then in any program, we have to consider how serious the disease is, how large the population is, and operational issues that may affect study design. Ultimately, to me, it feels like what we really need is some way to bring together what I believe, or some have described as opposing forces. That is, that regulatory precedents and the confidence we have sometimes goes against the need to innovate. So if we have a well-worn path, why would we need to innovate? But what I would argue is that sometimes when we have regulatory precedents that have told us and that we leverage the learnings from those precedents and say maybe we can do it a better way or a more efficient way, that leads us to innovation. So it's not always that the regulatory precedent works against innovation, but I do think that if we look very carefully at what we've learned, it can spur us to think about new ways to do things. In the final few minutes of my talk, I do want to talk about the importance of the involvement of stakeholders and just review with you the efforts that FDA has in bringing forward the patient voice in drug development. FDA implemented a program called Patient-Focused Drug Development, or PFDD. And you can see described as really how do we systematically incorporate the patient voice, experiences, and perspectives into the drug development and evaluation approach, or drug development evaluation leading to review of the drugs by FDA. There was a report published on the first several years. PFDD was implemented as part of PDUFA 5 back in 2012. And FDA is currently working on a series of guidances related to PFDD. So really has spent the last 9 years trying to capture patient voice in many different ways in all aspects of FDA work. I also want to point out the important work that FDA has done on the pediatric side to bring together not just patients, but all stakeholders to address tough topics in therapeutics development that have really required the collaboration of all stakeholders. And you can see here several workshops over the last just 2 years that are pediatric specific and that have really, I think, helped get certain really hard and complex areas unstuck for the benefit of children. And we accomplish this largely by convening all stakeholders and having them sit at the table to have the discussion. I'm really proud of the work that FDA has done in this area. So what are our challenges and opportunities? I've highlighted these, and I really do hope that we have time to discuss them throughout the course of the next 2 days. Certainly, there's a need to decrease time from adult approval to a time when children are able to use that drug approved specifically for them. We need to think about how we get pediatric specific diseases studied. It shouldn't always be adults first, and that includes neonates and pediatric rare diseases. There certainly is a need to continue to innovate in ways to get drugs delivered to children more consistently and more easily. And certainly, it goes without saying that the pandemic has demonstrated, I think, to all of us that there's really a need to consider globally the health needs of children, not just in our own regions, but across the globe. And that leads me just to a few comments I have about lessons that I have learned from the pandemic that I think may be applied actually more broadly to pediatric therapeutics development. There's certainly, we have learned a need to obtain alignment across the globe with regulators, and not just from regulators, but a need to think earlier about what needs to be accomplished so that children can be studied, if needed, as early as is appropriate. So what kind of non-clinical, what kind of formulation needs to be done, what kind of endpoints, biomarkers, natural history needs to be collected so that children can be enrolled as soon as is reasonable and appropriate. In addition, I think we've learned that decentralized clinical trials has been a very important way to keep the wheels turning during the pandemic. And I think that decentralized clinical trials can also be very effectively applied in the post-pandemic world to get trials done, not just to get them done more efficiently, but I think as a really important tool to improve and increase on the diversity of populations and the inclusion of generally underrepresented populations. Obviously, I hope I've already made the point about the importance of global collaborations and including reliance and even potentially work sharing to help increase the efficiency of trials and reviews and consideration of streamlining protocol and adaptive reviews and alignment as we gain more information. So my final thoughts, and that was my signal that my 30 minutes are up, that therapeutics development has advanced greatly over the last 20 years, but there is really a need for early planning. I hope I've proven that point to you, and that there's always a need for data collection, and as soon as it can be done, really will benefit children, both from the perspective of getting them enrolled earlier, but also decreasing the amount of data that potentially needs to be collected in that pediatric population. Transparency and communication between regulators and sponsors, between patients and clinical trialists, between academicians and sponsors, between the whole ecosystem of drug development is critical. Collaboration and cooperation, again, I think I've made that point clear that we really have been working on that, but it still needs additional work. And then my final thought that I want to leave with you is the second to last bullet, that I think it boils down to that what we want to do for children is get drugs developed, evaluated, and approved with better speed and efficiency, but not at the cost, right, of losing certainty and precision. And that's where the sweet spot lies, I believe. And I hope that over the course of the next 2 days, we'll talk a lot about hitting that sweet spot. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. Thank the organizers for inviting me. And I believe we have a few minutes available for some questions. So thank you again. I look forward to the discussions that will come forth during the next 2 days.